So the greatest civilization of the ancient world left us absolutely no decipherable writing.
Not at all.
Right. We don't know the names of their kings. We don't know the names of their gods. But because of the dirt beneath their streets, we actually know exactly what they valued.
Yeah, it completely flips the script on how we usually study history. I mean, usually you look at a towering monument or read about some massive historical event, and your eyes are naturally drawn to the surface level, right?
Yeah, the grand speeches, the gold, all that marble.
Exactly. The marble facades. But the invisible groundwork, that's what dictates whether a structure or, a society lasts a decade or a millennium.
And that is exactly the mission for this deep dive into the sources today. So we're taking a stack of material, a really detailed research paper on the ancient urban planning of the Indus Valley civilization, an architectural breakdown of the Taj Mahal, and Mahatma Gandhi's writings on his philosophy of nonviolence.
Which is a pretty wild mix, I have to admit.
It is, but we are tearing them all down to the studs. Because for you listening, whether you're building a city, a monument, or a social movement, we're looking at one thing today. We're looking at foundations.
Yeah, and these might seem like totally unrelated subjects at first glance. I mean, you have ancient ruins, a 17th century mausoleum, and a 20th century sociopolitical movement.
Right.
But as we dig into the actual mechanisms of how these things were built, a very clear pattern emerges from the sources.
Okay, so let's wind the clock all the way back to 3300 BCE and look at some of the most incredibly practical builders in human history. We're heading to the Indus Valley civilization, specifically the Harappan settlements, places like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa.
Yeah, so this is a civilization that flourished across what is now India and Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
And their approach to building was, well, it was a total paradigm shift for the ancient world.
How so?
Well, you look at contemporary societies like ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, and their engineering was largely dedicated to monumental architecture for the elite, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pyramids for pharaohs, massive temples, that sort of thing.
Right, giant vanity projects.
Exactly. But the Harappans, they took a completely different route.
Yeah, and the level of logistical detail in these sources is just staggering. I mean, they didn't just build homes organically over time like most ancient cities. They planned entire cities on a meticulously organized grid layout.
Yeah, perfectly aligned.
Right. The streets were aligned to the cardinal directions, north, south, and east, west. But, okay, let's unpack this because here is the part that genuinely confuses me.
What's that?
The research points out that they used standardized fired clay bricks with consistent dimensions across hundreds of miles of territory.
Mm-hmm.
How do you enforce a standardized building code in 3300 BCE without, tape measures or a centralized communication network?
So what's fascinating here is that the brilliance is actually in the math. They didn't rely on a specific universal unit of measurement, like, a modern inch or a centimeter.
Okay.
They relied on a ratio. Every single brick across the civilization was fired to a ratio of 1 to 2 to 4.
Oh, wow. So just pure proportion.
Exactly. The height, width, and length were perfectly proportional. So it didn't matter if a local builder made a slightly larger brick, so long as that 1 to 2 to 4 proportion was maintained.
That makes so much sense.
Right. This meant that walls could seamlessly interlock, creating incredibly stable load-bearing structures without needing a modern factory to stamp out identical pieces.
I mean, my city can barely patch a pothole on a modern grid system, and these builders were engineering interlocking load-bearing walls at scale.
Yeah, it's humbling.
It really is. And then there's the plumbing. I was reading this and I was like, wait, are we sure this is 3300 BCE?
Well, the plumbing is incredible.
We're talking covered drains for wastewater, public wells, and multi-story buildings with indoor bathrooms.
Yeah, the mechanics of that plumbing system are arguably their greatest achievement. They engineered a dual drainage system.
How did that work?
Well, the streets were slightly sloped so that rainwater would wash the streets clean, while a completely separate covered underground system took wastewater away from living areas.
That is so smart.
And it gets better. Many homes had their own wells for clean water and terracotta pipes that funneled waste directly into the street drains. And those drains were actually equipped with maintenance covers, so city workers could clear blockages.
So it's basically a public works department functioning thousands of years before the Roman aqueducts.
Pretty much, yeah.
But this brings up a huge question for me. If they were this incredibly advanced and they had mastered this level of egalitarian infrastructure, I mean, no massive palaces, just an extreme focus on public health, why did they just disappear? And why do we know so little about who they actually were?
Well, the current archaeological consensus points toward the environment. Around 1300 BCE, massive shifts in climate And the shifting courses of the monsoon-fed rivers effectively dried out their agricultural base.
Ah, so they literally couldn't feed themselves anymore.
Right. But while the cities themselves were eventually abandoned, the structural logic wasn't.
Interesting.
Yeah, that foundational principle of standardized construction, proportional masonry, and organized city layouts that heavily influenced subsequent urban planning across the entire Indian subcontinent for centuries.
So the Harappans basically proved that a foundation built on proportional math and public welfare outlasts the actual names of its rulers.
Beautifully said.
But, okay, let's jump forward a bit. If we go to 1632, to the height of the Mughal Empire, we see builders taking those fundamental engineering concepts and applying them to something entirely different.
Right.
They applied it to grief. I'm talking about the Taj Mahal.
Yeah, commissioned by the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan to honor his wife, Mumtaz Mahal, after she died in childbirth. The sources actually describe it as an attempt to recreate paradise on Earth.
And it really looks like it.
It does. It's a structure that seamlessly blends Persian, Ottoman, and Indies design traditions into just this single unified vision.
And the sheer amount of specialized labor is wild to read about.
Oh, absolutely.
You had Ustad Ahmad Lahori, who is widely regarded as the chief architect, coordinating literally an army of artisans. You had master calligraphers like Amanat Khan and specialists in pietratura, that intricate stone inlay work where artists like Curangelo were grinding down semi-precious stones to fit flawlessly into the marble.
And that's just the surface level. Before we even get to that decorative layer, the materials themselves were carrying a massive political weight.
Right. Let's talk about the materials.
So the visual language of the Taj Mahal is deeply calculated. The builders used luminous Makrana white marble for the main mausoleum. Now, in traditional Indian architectural texts, white marble was historically associated with Brahmins, symbolizing spiritual purity.
Oh, I see.
But the surrounding structures, like the mosques and the gateways, those are built from red sandstone. And red sandstone was traditionally linked to the Kshatriyas, the warrior and ruling class.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because they are actively weaving the social hierarchy of India into the color palette of the building itself.
Exactly that. It was a highly sophisticated way for a Muslim emperor to visually integrate the Hindu ruling classes of India. It creates this harmonious cultural and political blend.
That aesthetic brilliance is undeniable. But reading through the architectural breakdown, building this massive, impossibly heavy stone structure on the muddy banks of the Yamuna River sounds like a geological nightmare.
Oh, it was a massive engineering challenge. If they had just laid a standard stone foundation, the sheer weight of the marble would have caused the entire structure to unevenly sink into the soft riverbank.
Which would just destroy it.
Yeah, it would have cracked the dome within a few years. So to prevent this, the engineers utilized a system of deep well foundations.
Okay.
They dug these massive, incredibly deep cylindrical wells straight down into the water table and filled them with rubble, mortar, and timber.
Wait, timber, you might be thinking the same thing I was when I read that. Putting wood into a wet riverbank sounds like a terrible idea.
Right.
Wouldn't it just rot and collapse under all that weight?
Under normal circumstances, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. But they specifically chose ebony wood
Okay, why ebony?
because ebony is incredibly dense, and its unique cellular structure actually requires constant, high levels of moisture to maintain its strength.
Wait, really?
Yeah, if it dries out, it turns brittle and cracks. But submerged in the damp soil of the Yamuna riverbed, it remains rock solid.
That is insane.
So the river wasn't a threat to the foundation. The river was engineered to sustain the foundation.
That is an unbelievable piece of engineering. You are literally relying on the water that threatens to sink you to keep your building afloat. And they didn't stop there. The entire monument sits on a massive elevated platform of brick and mortar, protecting the delicate marble from the Yamuna's seasonal floods. But here is the mechanism that absolutely blew my mind. The famous 4 minarets that surround the main dome.
Oh, yeah.
When you look at them, they seem perfectly upright.
They do, but they are actually tilted slightly outward away from the central tomb.
Right. It's a subtle optical illusion, but more importantly, it's a structural failsafe. It operates a lot like base isolation in modern earthquake engineering.
Yeah.
If a massive seismic event hits, those towers aren't going to collapse inward and crush the central dome where the cenotaphs are housed.
Yeah, they are mechanically predisposed to fall outward, away from the passengers, basically,
Yeah.
like an architectural airbag.
Exactly, an airbag.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the geometry governing all of this is relentless. You see the number 4 repeating constantly in the design.
Why the number 4?
In Islamic architectural tradition, 4 represents balance, logic, and structure. So the